Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal and you are watching the fifth dispatch with the penultimate dispatch of a series of thought leadership discussions with Ramathan Mangal. First, we are feeling sad that this is a penultimate episode, but let's see sort of how life moves on from here. And Mr. Shroff has promised all of us for a fun session at the end of it. But that apart, on a more serious note, joining us today, as always, is Mr. Cyril Shroff, the managing partner at Sri Ramathan Mangal Das. We also have Santosh Shanti Rao, who's a partner and the head of Please also help me welcome the external speaker, Mr. Ramesh Subramanian, the CFO of Tata Power. Gentlemen, it was my sheer pleasure and privilege to be hosting you for this episode.
Thank you. Good morning.
Yeah. Today's episode is just really at the heart of all mainstream conversations. It's a very mainstream topic, and if this country really had the ambition to become a 5 trillion economy very soon, infrastructure is really at the heart of it. Now, the question is that the infrastructure sector is finding itself into a double whammy situation. Number one are the strained government finances, with focus diverted to immediate financial measures for necessary economic support and healthcare spend. And the second, of course, is the delay in infrastructure project pipelines, thereby pushing out economic recovery. There's a reason that people sort of connect the infrastructure spending to public welfare. And I would sort of quote some data here. As per the Economic Policy Institute, every $100 spent on infrastructure boosts private sector output by $13 in the median run and about $17 in the long run. Furthermore, each $100 billion infrastructure spending would boost job growth by roughly 1 million full time equivalents. These are very large numbers. Now, this strong correlation between infrastructure investment and economic knobs has always been top of the mind of various policymakers, especially in emerging markets such as ours, with a young mix in demographics that require strong employment opportunities. Across the board, in our conversations with various stakeholders, when we talk about what will really establish the infrastructure recovery curve, there are four large themes that are emerging. Number one of the paramount importance really is the financial stability is paramount. That is the big sort of sounding advice coming from the stakeholders. Second is the technology to transform infrastructure service delivery. Third is revisiting the new normal in processing and return expectations. Fourth is ESG factors to become a priority. And fifth is how do you strengthen deal pipeline for diversified portfolios to drive the market. In the conversation today, with a very meaningful panel that we have today, we will unravel all those aspects. In a very meaningful piece published in the Mint yesterday, Mr. Shroff highlighted that unprecedented situations like this require unprecedented solutions. To quote him, I would like to quote him and said that unprecedented situations like the present requires unprecedented solutions, and the time is right for the government to head back to the drawing board to put in place a progressive plan for the PPPs to kickstart with a whole new DNA. Perhaps, Mr. Shroff, I would like to say the context. What exactly do you mean with the whole new DNA of PPP model? India's tryst with PPP has not necessarily been so successful, given the stress in the sector. It is kind of unraveling itself. Give us some color and sense there.
Thank you, Shrija, and thanks once again for hosting this delightful series. And I share the sadness that this is the penultimate one, but there can always be more seasons as we discuss. So I think you set it up. You set it up beautifully for the next step. Now, if I can personalize this conversation a bit. Now, looking back at my career of roughly about 38 years as a lawyer, I became a projects finance lawyer and a projects lawyer before I became a corporate expert. That happened later. So I go back to the sort of early 90s when a kind of a paradigm shift happened in terms of how infrastructure projects were to be financed. The early 90s. I know it's a long time ago, but we talked of those fast track projects, some of which are still being completed. Uh, we go back to that time, and I think the big change we saw at that time was that the state kind of took a step back and asked the private sector to come in, both domestically as well as global developers to come into India, invest their dollars, bring their deal technology, to come and build a new India, which was unfolded after the famous 1991 reforms. So I think these are very historically well recorded facts, and what we saw in the roughly 30-year journey since then, it's not exactly 30, I think they're about 28 years, but let's roughly 3 decades journey, we've seen a big upgrade in the country's infrastructure. If we go back to at that point of time, I mean, the airports that we experienced, the roads that we experienced, the telephone system that we experienced, all of that, there have been a lot of wins and we've seen a big change. But a consequence of that has been that the Indian public and the Indian consumer has now got used to a very different style, different standard of experiencing public goods in the form of infrastructure. And his demands are getting even higher. So there is a continuous demand for better and better quality of infrastructure. That genie is out of the bottle. And also, what has happened since the world has got more globalized since then is that the Indian public is also aware of the quality of infrastructure available globally, and they are asking for it. They are asking for stable power supply. They are asking for better telecom services. They are asking for better airports. Now, I mean, we created some wonderful projects in the country as well, but for a country of 1.3 billion people, there is a big demand gap. So there is a massive gap in terms of both quantity and quality of infrastructure that is needed. The traditional method of using state funds was not an option even in the 90s, and it is even less an option today. So the funding has to come, and the resources and the technology has to come either from the private sector or in a kind of a public-private partnership. Now, if we look at this journey of the last 30 years, as I said, there have been some wins, but there have also been some losses, and there are a lot of learnings. In this period, in this sort of 3 decades, I think we have gathered a lot of experience in terms of how the public-private partnership model works, the PPP model. How does a model that was invented in Western legal systems play out in an emerging economy, which has got so many inequalities, it has got overburdened the justice system, and it has got kind of a slightly third world mentality. Where how does all this play out when you take those kind of contracts and projects and superimpose them in this market? What works and what doesn't work? And various stakeholders have learned in this. I think the policymakers have also educated themselves, so has the judiciary, so has the private entrepreneur, and regulators as well. So if I go back to my first memories of some of the power purchase agreements, that for the power, I think, was the first sector to experience kind of a modern project finance technique. And some of those agreements India was seeing for the first time. And there was an element of fear about them. What does all this mean? Why do you need a 30-page contract which kind of binds you for a 30-year period with all sorts of things? And people just kind of did, without understanding, fully sign some of these agreements. A lot of that played out, and things even just stray words here and there. For example, like 2 lines in a change in law contract, where at that stage you could imagine what it would mean, but we experienced a lot of what that meant. So that experience, and I think it has evolved very differently than it has evolved in Western markets. I believe that if we look at the future journey to the $5 trillion economy, whenever that happens, or the way forward, that what got us here is not going to get us there. We need to completely reimagine the entire development and financing paradigm. And if I look back and try to summarize the last 30 years, I see 4 big problems. Apart from all the wins, I mean, I'm not saying that we've not achieved a lot. I think we have achieved a massive amount in terms of all these projects, but there's still 4 big themes that emerge. One is the mentality underlying concession agreements. Call them licenses, concession agreements, power purchase agreement, whatever it is. That they are extremely one-sided. They are not designed for the private sector to earn reasonable returns. They have been designed with a kind of a trust deficit, which makes it almost impossible for the private sector to earn reasonable returns. And therefore, it cascades down to the fact that it will be very difficult to get equity financing. The public equity markets will never understand these contracts, and even expert investors who are used to dealing with this sector will struggle with how this plays out. So that's one. The second, I think, is that the financing contracts, the financing agreements, which are different for corporate finance and for balance sheet financing and project financing, are also quite one-sided. Again, part of the reason for that is because in the concession agreements and how the state designed these concessions, they effectively ask the lenders to take a lot of the risk. Completion risk is not taken by the lenders. And in many of our concession agreements, that we have seen that many of the risks which ought to be either on the equity or on some other party have actually been pushed on to the lenders, which kind of leads to a joke that goes around is that the debt is the real equity and equity is the real debt. The third point, I think, is the paradigm of the institution of an independent regulator and a competition law regime. So, whilst we have made some baby steps towards evolving credible independent regulation for sectors, I think there is a long way to go, because success in sectors depends upon a truly independent and bold independent regulators who can draw the line when there is either unfair competition or there are genuine difficulties that need to be alleviated in order to protect all parties. I think there's a lot of learning that still remains there. And last and not the least, and I come back to my profession, is I think the enforcement and the judicial system. It just takes forever. And a lot of the reasons why project finance type of structure, which are essentially a set of very complicated matrix contracts, work because you can, when there is a problem, you can take them to the court and get them enforced. The problem with our system is that once, even if you have a wonderfully drafted and well thought out contract, by the time you try to get them enforced, I mean, we've lost the plot. So all of this put together makes it very difficult in the PPP model, both to attract equity or to attract debt. And in the absence of that, there is a huge funding gap. And what we therefore eventually land up with is that the buck is going to stop really at the Indian version of Buckingham Palace, where finally that's where the checks will have to come from. So if the state really wants the private sector and global capital to come in, they'll have to deal with all these four. They'll have to stop having these one-sided contracts where we presume in a contractual sense that everybody is a thief. The second, that the financing documents will need to be more balanced. We need an upgrade on independent and competition law regime, and we need better enforcement. If we fix all these four points, I think India will become the number one destination in the world for attracting capital, without a doubt. I think the other one before us was China, and they created an amazing set of infrastructure projects, and their infrastructure is amongst the finest in the world. But for various reasons, which I won't get into over here, that story is over. Firstly, they're saturated, and secondly, now China has a kind of a particular connotation in the world. So, which is the other market in the world which can absorb capital and technology at that scale? It's us. So, there is an imperative to solve this problem. So, I hope that on the other side of this, we see some improvements along this, and I'm quite hopeful that the state will do it. So, I'll stop over here and hand it back to you for taking it forward and developing the balanced themes.
Yeah, I think that's a very sort of strong piece of advice and messaging coming from regulators that 4 things that they need to look at. And right now it's kind of investing in a perfect storm given the kind of interpretation China has and the interconnectedness of supply chains are coming in this camp. This could be India's time, given the 4 reasons that Mr. Shroff just outlined could be solved for. Ramesh, I want to sort of come to you now as a practitioner. and a big one at that, at Tata Power, Lakshmi Launch. How can such a one really recreate the magic of mid 2000s when one talks about the infrastructure space? What really are we lacking? We know. What are the solutions and where can we go from here? And how are you thinking through this?
Thank you very much, and thank you to Cyril and Mint for organizing this. Normally I always feel that the infrastructure discussions are a competition of who cries most. So, but let's try and make it more lighter and probably more positive. Okay. Now, I'm picking up from where Cyril left. Holistically, if you look at if what should be the way infrastructure should be planned as a government, I have four kind of points. One is you should be focusing on who makes how much money, okay, of infrastructure. For the moment, just hear my points, and then I think maybe I'll be able to communicate that. The first point about infrastructure is it is all about utilization and efficiency of the asset. How you utilize and how efficiently you utilize, how productively you utilize, has to be the focus of any policy making. That's point number one. Point number two is there shouldn't be a fear on people earning high returns, and I think Cyril mentioned that. And I'm not saying this from a capitalist point of view, okay? I'm not saying that people who put infrastructure should get 40% return on equity. No, because that will raise the cost of the service that it provides. But what is important to realize is that at a holistic level, what will people do if they earn more on one project? What will they do? They actually invest in another project. So basically, you are paving way for one investment to put back into other investment, because at one leading bureaucrat who was heading the planning commission for a long time, and he made a comment that even assuming that all the businesses were a bunch of thieves, and they were running so-called successful businesses, assume that they are thieves for the moment. Now, where will they put the money? They'll put the money in some tax haven. They save taxes, but what will they do ultimately? They're going to be wanting to expand their empires and building back to, most of it will come back to the country, because where else there is a need for investment and where else they are comfortable investing. So I'm just saying, from a holistic point of view, that getting a high return is not necessarily a crime. The third point is, in infrastructure, errors will happen. If you are imagining that errors won't happen, errors of judgment won't happen, risks won't materialize, then I think you're living in a fool's paradise. So therefore, every infrastructure comes with that risk, and therefore one should be pragmatic, both as stakeholders, as investors, lenders, even rating agencies or government or policymakers, regulators must realize first the fact that everyone can go wrong. Tell me which agency has not gone wrong in any infrastructure project. Who in the world has had a flawless record all the time? So E and OE is perfectly all right. And the fourth point is, resolving is not bailing out. Resolving infrastructure assets through amicable dispute resolutions is par for the industry. It is nature to this, second nature to these industries. Therefore, there is nothing to be ashamed of when you try to resolve the assets by way of amicable resolution. I'm not saying that it should be rewarding people who have been reckless, rewarding people who have been careless, rewarding who have gamed, but certainly assets need to be resolved. So I think these are four high-level issues. I think when we go deep into infrastructure, that we realize, and in India particularly, I think we have enough and more lessons learned in the last 10 years on infrastructure. I think the banks have learned their lessons, the auditors have learned their lessons, the rating agencies have learned their lessons, lawyers, I'm sure, would have learned their lessons, and promoters, of course, have learned and burnt. So therefore, and government has also realized what it does to the system to have stranded assets without a resolution. I think it's a complete waste of national property, because to imagine that by not resolving an asset, you are punishing the promoter is completely misconception, because 75% of the funds are coming from the banks and the larger institutions. Even the 25% that comes from the promoter is again held by, in many cases, by mutual funds and insurance companies and larger investor bases. So the real punishment you are trying to give is to that small 5-10% stakeholder, and the 90% stakeholders suffers. I think these are the broad high-level points that I thought I'll make to just start the conversation.
Thanks for those, Ramesh. I think you have sort of very beautifully laid down from a very pragmatic view from a practitioner's point of view, and a strong sort of piece of advice going there. But if you were to give me, the pockets of opportunity that you see in the infra space, and very briefly on that, before I get on to Santosh, because you'll have a more realistic view on that because you're executing those projects, what would those really be?
Okay. So I think, if you look at the country today, I think we are very clearly desperately needing high quality infrastructure. I think we must learn from China, and as Cyril mentioned, I think the way they went about infra is building some massive capabilities ahead of time. Now, yes, there would be some amount of wastage in that process because you put the cart before the horse, but that's okay, because government is the only one who can take that initiative and do it. India today lacks badly on roads, rail connectivity, port connectivity, airport connectivity, power, gas, and coal. I think that every sector we have a long way to go, and modernizing them, creating new structure and connecting the country, even the river transport, for example. There is a massive opportunity, and I think the last count which I remember was, I don't know, maybe that was McKinsey or some other consultant, $1.5 trillion spent that's just waiting to happen. I think we have a huge opportunity here in two ways. One, you got a young population who's looking for jobs and employment. Two, you have an unmet demand for quality infrastructure, and you have nowhere reached the global levels of infrastructure use. Third, today in this economy, in this stage, we have very little option other than infrastructure to start the entire cycle of jobs. I think and I would say that regardless of fiscal pressures, if this is not the time for the infrastructure to be invested in all the sectors which I mentioned, there's no other better time, because we will not only need it, it will also kickstart the economy, kickstart the demand cycle, also begin a new cycle of investments, and the world is waiting with huge liquidity. Investors are sitting there out there looking for a stable environment to invest. All we have to do is to get the right environment, and I think there's a huge partnership waiting to happen between the global investor world, Indian private entrepreneurs, and the government. I think it's a huge opportunity to tap. I think it's only up to us. Only we can spoil this thing, and nothing can stop us from doing a good job.
Santosh, I sort of come to you now. We heard from both of them, as Cyril sort of laid out this strong piece of advice to the regulators. Ramesh pointed out a pragmatic view from a practitioner's point of view, where he sees the pockets of opportunity. And both of them reiterated that this could be the golden run for India in the infrastructure space, provided we solve for the problems that we have. Now, give me some on-the-ground sense. The conversation perhaps is kind of all the time coming back to the problem of financing, which seems to be the mood problem behind infrastructure. Give me some on-the-ground sense and color, what you are talking with different classes of investors, what really are the problems they are facing, what are you hearing from the promoter side, and has the pandemic aggravated some of the challenges as such?
Sure. Thanks, Shrija. Maybe this can be split into two sides of the discussion. One is the problem of financing itself, and the other is the problem of the contract. And I think that goes to the root of financing as much as anything else. Maybe we'll address the problem of the contract. Mr. Shroff alluded to the problem of the contract at the beginning, clearly saying that it's a one-sided contract, and the way we've gone about it. But there are a couple of more problems to that kind of contract. The first that we see is, there is a general approach that we have seen, particularly in PPP contracting. And I want to talk about power in a slightly different way, but just PPP contracting as we speak. To be a kind of one-size-fits-all model whether it's a model concession, whether it's a BOT concession for roads, whether it is the method of approaching the contract from a government point of view. We will use a certain base and we will try and use that base everywhere. This is the base model that has happened. It's led to some interesting and maybe slightly absurd results. We've seen contracts in rooftop energy and solar, which are modeled on a road concession law. So, a small project effectively has to set up an escrow. The ownership is with not with the developer, and the kind of financials that are permitted are 25-year long-term financing. Either multilaterals or government bodies or public sector banks or NBFCs. So if you look at this, and that's just one example of how we face this problem of one size fits all. That's one big problem. So we need to get out of this one size fits all approach. We need to have a sectoral approach. We need to have a partnership driven approach, less contract driven approach to writing this kind of a concession document. And the moment you have the financier, you have the developer, and you have the regulator / government all stepping in to write this contract well, you will solve 50% of the problems that face the financing side. Most of it relates to either bankability of this contract. Is it well written? Is it, are there ambiguities written into the contract which nobody seems to want to kind of resolve? That's the first part of the problem. And we do this on a daily basis. I mean, you see new contracts which are coming in, we still continue to have this problem. It's not a 20-year-old problem. It's not even a 10-year-old problem. It's actually a current problem. So that's one part of it. The second part of it, in terms of the financing problem per se, is this fundamental aspect of approaching financing, at least from a regulator / governmental point of view, is not to realize two things. One is, like Ramesh put it, none of these contracts can ever be perfect. They cannot solve every problem that comes along the way, particularly cash flow issues, particularly how the market is behaving, particularly what the world is, including COVID, or any such event that could happen. So the contracts are kind of, they're kind of hard and brittle in that sense. So they might snap if you kind of not allow them to deal with it. And lenders don't know how to solve this problem. Why don't lenders know how to solve this problem? The contracts also assume that there will be a mismatch between, they assume that there is no mismatch between the contract life and financing. Whereas in the real world, there is always a mismatch between the amount of time you're able to get this financing for and the life of this contract. How do you resolve this? How do you then, therefore, get financing that is age appropriate to the contract? That's a huge problem. Added to this, the kind of people who can actually lend money today in reality are people like certain public sector banks, certain multilateral financial institutions. That's it. I mean, we have to stop at this list for long-term financing of projects. And even there, public sector banks are not able to lend as long, and that not all of them, just a few of them actually lend today, are not able to lend for the length of the time that you need to resolve for. So if you have this mismatch problem, how do you then solve it? Either we allow extremely long-term financing and meet this mismatch between asset life and financing, or we allow for slightly more innovative models of financing to be built into these contracts. So therefore, I think the malleability of being able to kind of structure financing, to be able to structure new kinds of lending, be it a bond, be it an InvIT kind of structure, be it some kind of, revolver, the ability to refinance and bring in new capital into this is another critical element of being able to finance. And the final element of this is your ability to kind of move assets. See, since we have Ramesh on this webinar, if Ramesh has to reinvest and put money into new projects, Ramesh has to exit old projects. To that extent, we have to make that easier. We cannot make that a controlled substance. We cannot make it a difficult exercise. We have to recognize the fact that this is reinvestable capital. with different kinds of equity interest, different kinds of pools of capital that need to come in at different points in time to the project. And that recognition needs to be there. I think these are the kind of 3 points I will stop with.
Yeah, Santosh, those are sort of fair points sort of mentioned. I come to you now, Ramesh, and I want to understand from you. I mean, he sort of also reiterated the fact that perhaps new modes of financing are required. And he mentioned that bonds and InvITs are coming into the fore. Two questions to you that, how do you see these InvITs as a product series of mitigating the financing needs for infrastructure? We also have a new set of investors coming in by way of long-term annuity-seeking pension funds. I remember when I interviewed Mark Machin, and he said something very interesting that we are looking at very credible partners in India, and our corporate governance standards are very high. And secondly, he also mentioned that there's nothing like renting something and living off it. Essentially, he was mentioning and the fact that how do you sort of sit on long yielding annuity incomes. So you think that India really offers some of those, and perhaps it's the time to look at different set or profile of investors, like more multilateral institutions who can take more sovereign risk in times of pandemic. To think like that, and also what really then has been the China playbook in terms of financing infra projects. One does know that a lot of that backstop financing happens through the government, but what really is India lacking in terms of financing?
So, here let's talk about some of the critical aspects here. One is, why is infrastructure returns lower than many other industries in terms of return on investment? Why on the equity? It's simple. The risks are supposedly lower. Okay, especially I'm not saying every infrastructure, most infrastructure, because they're backed by some kind of offtake assurances and pricing assurances. So relatively, those risks, those are low income earning, but they are also seen as very sure short way to, as Mark Machin's words, renting for life. Now, that being the feature, I think we have to importantly ensure and protect that the infrastructure assets that we put up are therefore low on risk, high on assurance, and less on uncertainties. Okay. Now, today the investor world, which is waiting to come to India, and we've been talking to several sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And I'm amazed that despite the several setbacks, for example, power sector, we know that it's always one step forward and two step backwards. Okay, and we've seen this day in and day out. Luckily for us, it's such a necessity that regardless of what the DISCOM does, at the end of the day, the government bails it out and pays for the power. Okay, but there are other anomalies, which is a separate issue. The investors today still believe the long-term story, number one. They are willing to come to India and invest at a low return, relatively low return. But they really are worried about some of the surprises that the Indian system keeps throwing. Okay, state government suddenly questioning past contracts, sudden new tax norms, and sudden shifts in policies at times. So, but still, I'm saying there is a lot of positivity, provided we get some of the things, straightened out. Now, what are the things? The asset liability mismatch, which Santosh mentioned, I think there is a huge opportunity, and I'm glad to say that the government is now moving very fast on that, is to allow, first of all, instruments like InvITs, okay, which really is a very powerful instrument for several reasons. One, it isolates the assets between construction risk and operating assets. First of all, it allows you only selective assets. Second, it allows you to repatriate, or let's say take back capital very flexibly, dividend, interest, or redemption of units, and it has got tax benefits. So it's a very good combination, and a strong regulation from SEBI also. But you know what? Whatever structure you bring in, ultimately what we have to ensure is that lenders, when they lend to these projects, have the capability to have a asset liability matching. And for that, the pension funds, the Indian pension funds, the PF funds, the insurance sector, They all have to be allowed. And I think I'm glad to say that banks, finally RBI has asked the banks to form their own policy to lend to InvITs, because the biggest struggle is, legally speaking, these instruments are still to be, kind of democratized in the system and internalized. So now the government is amending the Trust Act. Then the government is also encouraging the insurance companies to set up a certain percentage to be invested in the infra. But my worry is like this: if the asset is not properly assessed at the time of putting into, whether it's an InvIT or otherwise, okay, whoever is looking at these investments, I think one or two bad stories kill the whole story. So, for example, if the assessment done by the rating agencies is not proper, if the assessment done by the lenders is not up to the mark, one large project that goes fund will cost the entire infra. So we have to take care that the assessing of the project, what is called the entire project evaluation, that has to be stronger. We can't afford to repeat the mistakes that the PSU banks did of not spending enough time on the risk management and the risk involved in those projects and ending up with lakhs of crores of NPAs. I think that mistake clearly we have to avoid. And if you are going to allow the deep investors from outside, even more your governance standards have to be very high. Which means SEBI has to ensure that behavior is checked, bad behavior is checked, disclosures are up to the mark, so that there is confidence in the Indian infrastructure industry. Today, the confidence in the India infra entrepreneur is low. And therefore, because what is happening? Gold plating. For example, a simple thing which happened in India infrastructure. Gold plating was the name of the game. Every project was inflated by 50%, and loans were taken to fund that 50% extra. So effectively, promoters ended up owning the company with a very, very thin equity. Now, ultimately that results in higher pricing, and ultimately governments find it completely irrational, and then they want to cancel the contracts. This cycle has to be broken in the first instance. And why did the gold plating allowed to be happen under the watch of the lenders and the credit rating agencies and other functionaries who are attached to that asset? I think the governance aspect is becoming very critical to this story. The government is right in saying, look, so many things have gone wrong. But my other worry is that in the name of regulating this, in the effort to regulate this, should we be over-regulating it? And that brings to the whole point of that the regulator itself have to be carefully chosen, because lack of knowledge of the industry, lack of technical expertise, lack of depth of understanding of the sector can mean that the regulator is the wrong regulator to be in place, and he sets the wrong set of principles and it is wrongly implemented. So therefore, to cut the story short, I think India can only manage to spoil its own story. The world is there to kind of invest. We need to, both from the owner's side and the stakeholder side, we have to really be careful not to repeat the mistakes of the past.
That's very strongly said by Ramesh, and he has sort of clearly and very beautifully laid out our next segment. I come to you now, Mr. Shroff, that perhaps I think what I'm kind of sort of getting a sense from this conversation is that challenges are late at perhaps various levels. There's financing challenge, opportunity risk, concession risk, and all of that. But I think what Ramesh pointed out, that there has to be a deep understanding from the regulator's perspective on the technical aspects, on how perhaps there should not be a sense of over-regulation in our pursuit of regulating it. So are we saying that the time has perhaps come for an independent regulator with the correct wherewithal and knowledge for this space? If we really have to go the China way, what is your sense? Give us some cuts in that.
So once I will answer that question, but I took a slightly different message from what Ramesh said. And I think what he was saying is that it's only our game to lose as a nation, and that what we really need to be focusing upon is to create the right environment for infrastructure to thrive and for investment to come in. The demand is clearly there. What we need is to have clear rules of the game and also enforcement mechanism by which both debt and equity capital find this as an attractive opportunity to come in. And he mentioned a couple of things, one of which was certainty that needs to be created. And he gave the explanation of why infrastructure generally gets lower returns. But I feel that in India, some of those basic assumptions which go on and which underlie the theory of why infrastructure generally gets lower returns are itself in challenge in India.
Yeah.
So, a lot of infrastructure investors or even private equity funds, when you talk to them in terms of which sector you will invest, there are some funds who would say, even though they invest in infrastructure across the world, they will say that in India will invest in any sector except infrastructure. Why? Because the state is on the other side of these agreements. And the state, no matter what contract you have with them, will not pay you on time. A lot of infrastructure projects go into the red, even though they have billion contracts. Even when they are one-sided, they will just not pay because, and I think it goes down to a kind of a trust deficit. And this very issue has been mentioned by the finance minister herself, where I think in one of her talks she said that we are going to ensure that there are no unnecessary appeals and disputes. And if it's a fair resolution in an arbitration, for example, the state should pay. But on the ground, not that much has changed. So there is a vicious cycle just now of a trust deficit, where the state does not trust the private sector, and the private sector is kind of feeling battered and doesn't trust the state that it will be fair. So the vicious cycle has to be broken. If you want private entrepreneurs to come back and say, okay, I'm going to now build these 5 airports, I'm going to build these 10 power plants, or I'm going to build these 15 roads, for them to come back out of their shell, you need to recreate that atmosphere of trust. If the feeling is that firstly, after you go through the entire harrowing experience of putting together these contracts and raising the finance, and after that you find that when you send the next bill for payment, it's not paid, and then you have to fight like 3 years through the system, and you may not get paid at all. Which firstly, these are low margin businesses. Which business can survive when you have this kind of payment cycle? So it is, I think, the broader point that is being made is terms of clarity and recreating the trust in the framework. I think this is the biggest problem. I think there is a mountain of money waiting outside India to come in to be invested. We have the demand. We have 1.2 billion people which are just crying for better infrastructure. It's this gap between the money and the demand in this pipe that there is so much friction that needs to be removed. And this is where the state has to come in. And there is expertise available. There are multilateral agencies they have the expertise, they can help. If somebody has to bite the bullet. So I think these are my thoughts. Ramesh, you want to say something?
No, somebody has to bite the bullet, and
Yeah.
I think Ramesh was saying something. Yeah.
No, I was just reflecting on that. You see, the other let's look at positively. Let's look at how things will go ahead going forward. And the first thing is the PSU banks have to do a certain set of things. One is really, they've been now so much besieged and battered by their NPA issues that decision making is becoming very tough. If they take a view which is based on banks have to take risk. That's their business. But lending cannot be, all lending cannot be in government treasury, right? You have to have an element which will turn out to be a bad decision, and therefore I think the first task is really to get confidence back in the banking and financial system to say that as long as you have done a decent assessment, due diligence, it's perfectly okay if the bank makes some mistakes and losses. I think that has to be the only government can bring that confidence to the banks to say that okay, as long as you applied your mind, they took a call, it is okay. Because now we are mixing negligence of promoters and malpractice with pure business risk. there's no line between the two. So banks have to be protected, or funders have to be protected from that line of where they've done a mistake, honest mistake of assessing versus a fraud. I think these are two different issues. So first is to get that, so that the liquidity today in the banks today is not translating. They're so fearful of lending to slightly even less rated ventures. I think that's not what it's supposed to be. You just have to have a risk-adjusted rate of lending towards high-risk projects, but you cannot say no lending. So today that has to be resolved. The second is really the sector experts. The sector experts have to be party to both the policy making, the regulation, and the banking sector. Today, what is happening in the government, it becomes almost an unsaid law that regulators have to be ex-bureaucrats. So I think that is not to say that bureaucrats don't know the sector. Some know as good as anybody, but generally merit should be the criteria. Because if we want to get the right decisions, then we have to get the right people first. Otherwise, we will have this problem repeated again and again. And and also I think the other issue we must look at is the whole area of quick disposal of ongoing disputes. I think that area which I think Cyril or Santosh mentioned, I think that is really bleeding the industry. So many decisions will get delayed, whether it is at NCLT or in an arbitration or in the various commissions. I think there should be a concerted effort. I think a huge percentage of returns is getting lost in that whole battle of getting the right decisions. So I think these are some of the thoughts that I thought that I'll place it on the table.
Srija,
I just absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Peter, I just want to expand on one point and then maybe address one point that Ramesh raised. The point that raised on the public sector bank that being empowered to take proper business decisions. I would expand that point more. One of the points that we'll be speaking about is contracting as much as financing. And if we see the way contracting is written, it's actually fairly one-sided. There is no space for quote-unquote opening up of this contract once it is gone through its bid process. Whether it is on account of CBC issues or worried about Supreme Court decisions that will come and look at these contracts in the future. I think we need something that fixes that problem. Let me, simply put, I think this is a commercial contract that the government is entering. At the end of the day, they are a paying party, and I am a performing party as a private party. So why not give them some flexibility? Them being government bureaucracy, contract writers for the government, some flexibility to act or give them the freedom to act as commercial counterparties, rather than actually being kind of cowed down by all these investigations or judicial issues that are there. I'm not proposing a solution. I'm asking a question in terms of how we should do a thought process. And related to that is identifying or reimagining the concession models to kind of deal with this. I want to make one example here, which is Brazil, when it went through its if you remember, it went through a severe currency crisis where devaluation of the currency happened significantly about 10 years ago, 8-9 years ago. They introduced a concept in PPP which was not negotiation. They called it a readjustment of the contract to bring it back to what was the original intended economic outcome. At the time of bidding for both the parties who are actually who were at that point. It's perhaps time to think of something like that in terms of how to solve this problem. Like we said, a 30-year contract cannot be brittle. It has to be malleable. It has to kind of deal with the situations as they evolve over 30 years. That's one. The second part is on enforcement, and two parts to that. One is from a regulatory point of view. This is just a thought that Mr. Shroff and we debated at some point, which is that we have an AAR for tax, an advanced authority, which has rulings. When industry discovers that there is going to be a problem, I think the sectors need to come up with some kind of an advanced ruling mechanism. We try to keep solving the problem after it arrives. But why not try and solve the problem as we anticipated, both from a financing point of view, from an construction or development point of view, and if the sector experts, if technologically or through other executive means, counterparties are empowered, then this could be a successful point. And finally, we should also acknowledge some good news, which is that the amendments to the Arbitration Act, which is the other point Ramesh made, the amendments to the Arbitration Act, the commercial courts which have been established over 2015, both of these amendments in 2015 and then following in 2019, they've had some strides. The amount of time that we take for large commercial contractual arbitrations with governmental counterparties has come down by 40% because of these kind of this amendment to the Arbitration Act. And the commercial courts themselves have cut down between a civil court and a commercial court. It appears that the time has come down by again 30 to 40%. These are the good things that are happening. We need to build upon this, and we need to build upon the solutions that these can provide, but not rely on them alone. That's where I would stop.
So can I don't know whether you have time, Shuja?
Yeah, I think we are sort of getting to the last
Okay.
leg of our conversation, the last
Okay.
concluding remarks. Ramesh, you want to make a quick point, and then we can sort of get on to Mr. Shroff. Some things that we want to say.
Very quickly, I think Santosh made a great point. My experience, and we have this monster project called Mundra, which we are trying to solve for years, and it's a classic example of how simple problem cannot be resolved. Okay, now the lesson in that is, according to me, that if there is a pre-agreed mechanism, which either a law or a policy or a guideline, whatever you call it, which says that if there is an infrastructure project to be resolved, very clearly, a high percentage of the problem should be held by the promoter because he started it and he has to face the brunt. But the rest, a fair share should be shared by all the stakeholders as a concept, whether they are long-term contractors on the other end, government purchasing agencies, or whoever are the counterparties to it. I think that if we have that underlying principle that, well, it will be resolved, but the impact will have to be borne broadly in this share ratio, I think then everybody is clear that if something goes wrong, we know that there is a resolution possible, and B, that resolution will mean that the person who caused that problem or should have ideally taken care of that gets the brunt of it. So at least he knows, but it doesn't mean that he has to take the entire brunt and go down. So there is a way to deal with it in a very structural manner so that it becomes amicable. And that's the point I want to make.
Mr. Shroff, where do we sort of go from here? I think the consensus seems to be building in that there seems to be an overhaul of policy that is really required. We need to reimagine how we are sort of pursuing the entire infrastructure space. And I think in your piece, you also mentioned that, perhaps the government needs to come up with a TARP program, the TARP program of the US. And you also mentioned that perhaps some jurisdictions like Korea and the kind of philosophy that they have behind regulatory practices when it comes to infrastructure can come handy. Can you care to expand a bit more on that, as we come to the concluding remarks for this conversation?
So I'll break it into two parts. Firstly, we, just solving a lot of stranded assets and problems of the past. I think something like a TARP program, which in India might be some version of a bad bank with maybe sector expertise or sector focus, is part of the answer. But that's a conversation for another day. We picked up some of that on our first session on IBC as well, because you need to clean up. You need to clean up the past. So if you take a metaphor of a construction site where you're going to build something, but it has got an old dilapidated building over there, you first need to clean it up. So first, let's clean up and get that out of the way, and then you have a fresh site, and then you come up with your plans for building a new future, which is what India needs. I think what we need to do looking forward, and with a sense of much hope, is that you need to first capture the learnings of the last 25, 30 years. There are a lot of good and bad learning, something which Ramesh mentioned as well. And clinically look at the fact that, clinically analyze it and see what worked and what didn't. So almost every variety of risk that you can think of has surfaced in the last 25, 30 years. And if you need to, what you need to do is like a chemical analysis. Each risk is like a chemical, and you need to now bucket them to pick up on what Ramesh just said. Okay, this is a bundle of risks which goes into the promoter's box, and he has, because he's the owner, he's the one who started it. He has to carry this risk. So if something goes wrong on that front, let that risk be carried by the owner. And eventually, when the project is either sold or invited or something is done, that some of that risk goes to whoever is the new equity owner. Then you identify a risk, a set of risks which should belong to the debt or which should belong to other counterparties, say if there's a construction contract. So a very clinical, fair assessment needs to be done of the entire, almost as how you do a chemical analysis of a complex molecule and break it down to its core elements and reallocate those risks fairly to where they should belong. Once you do that, that will create a proper pricing, a risk-adjusted pricing mechanism for the financing that is available. Also, it will set the stage for fairer contracts, fairer and more transparent contracts. Half these problems have arisen because people, the contract turned out and the situation turned out in a manner that they never expected it would. So it's like playing a huge a game of cards with playing blind on half the way, whereas you actually thought that you were playing with knowing what your cards were. And it actually turned out that no, you didn't, because you were playing blind and there were a lot of invisible cards which you never even saw that kind of existed as well, and they came up from nowhere. Plus, this business of India mein kuch bhi ho sakta. You have that problem. As well. So, I think somebody should, grasp this problem by the scruff of its neck and say India is going to build the best infrastructure in the world because our 1.2 billion people need it. This is the way we are going to claw out of this pandemic crisis. And for that to happen, infrastructure is the primary growth engine. And we're going to take it, we're going to analyze it and make it a very financeable, bankable kind of investment opportunity. We're going to break it down and do it this way. What may be happening just now is that there is still a bias towards the old way of doing things. The way just now innovation will happen is you will take that 30-year-old contract and will mark it up. Or you will change some clause here and some clause over here and pass that off as a What needs to be done is all the old contracts need to be burnt and we need to start afresh. Something like what Manmohan Singh did in 1991, effectively took that whole thing and actually used the word, I remember, bonfire. He used the word of bonfire of the licensing Raj and started afresh. And the economic prosperity of the last 30 years is because he did lit that bonfire. We need another bonfire.
Wow, that's a very strong statement coming from the bonfire. So, are we sort of also in the stage for another independent regulator for the sector? What do you think? Has a time come for that?
Yeah, I think we already have independent regulators in most of these sectors. I think some tweaking is required, and I think to build on what Ramesh said, we need an infusion of technical expertise because a lot of these sectors are highly technical. You need scientific knowledge on some of these. I have no problem with bureaucrats. I think they're wonderful people, and the way they go through the IAS, they're capable of dealing with kind of any problem. You probably need to find a way of bolting on some technical industry expertise, and that will create actually a good mix.
Okay, Ramesh, any concluding remarks from your end? And I think we heard some very strong sort of recommendations coming from your end. You sort of spoke about the problems and the solution. One last piece of advice from you, what would that be? I would also like to ask you, in terms of innovation in the times of crisis, and that is also a very important point. As a large conglomerate, how are you thinking about innovating in this time? There's something about peak electricity that is coming into fore in the power space. Are you thinking of some of those areas?
Yeah. I think 2 points. One, I think we're probably underestimating the power of digital technology in the whole infra space. Today the renewable bidding, for example, the way the bidding has become matured, it's outstanding. Nowhere in the world today, I think the quality of the transparency of India's renewable bidding, you can match it. because it is so clear. There is no place for ambiguity. You are taking very clear risk. You're putting a button on your computer, knowing fully well. And more importantly, people have no other. Today, the discussion is not around how the bidding is done, but more importantly, how can I make money while doing the bid? So I think that the whole narrative has changed, which is how digital should be used to avoid interface and nepotism and fixing. All that things can be avoided. That's a message, and I think this COVID has brought a new meaning to innovation. And as a power company, we are realizing now that sorry to say, how less people we need to run the office, the organization efficiently, plants efficiently, and also segregate the waste from the important, the very important from the important. So I think there's a huge place for innovation. I think the other clear message innovation, which is we are learning now as a power company, is that a lot will depend on how you directly serve the consumer. As a power company, we were always thinking and happy being serving to the state and then let the state do the distribution. Today, we believe that having the consumer right access to the consumer is very critical. That's when you can do the best service, and that's when you can get the best feedback, and therefore that's where you become more efficient. The whole problem is in the value chain when you don't bother about the consumer, and power is one of the sectors which, unfortunately, the consumer is not the king. And I think we are realizing that we have to make him the king. Otherwise, we'll be missing the whole point.
Okay, there are some strong realizations coming in, getting back to the consumer and keeping the consumer at the center. Santosh, your managing partner said that there's another round of bonfire needed of contracts. Do you agree with him? What is your final sort of take on that?
So I mean, look, rethinking the contract is, I think, the fundamental order. I think it's extremely important that we rethink this contract and this risk allocation. I think the broad contours of risk allocation have always been known, but they've not really been implemented in the proper way. Ramesh reiterated that point, Mr. Shroff reiterated that point. So rethinking this contract, I think, is the starting point for any meaningful discussion. Not forgetting the fact that we are rethinking the contract in a new world of money, in a new world of counterparties, in a new world of consumers, as Ramesh rightly put, and technology. So you can't have a 1990s contract run through a digitally enhanced operating system of the 2010s or the 2020s as we now move in. I think this is probably extremely critical.
Okay. Now comes the rapid fire. So, Mr. Shroff, are you beginning it or am I beginning it? What is your sense here?
Are we? Sorry, I missed the question.
Are you going to ask the question? Am I asked?
You asked the question.
Okay, I'm going to begin with you, Ramesh. The highest and the lowest point in your career, what would that be? Quickly.
Oh my God.
I could have warned you about this.
I know. Well, very personal, direct question. Which I think the highest point was when we were able to tie up. Santosh was part of the journey. When we tied up the Mundra financing, which is very unique. We raised close to 13,000 crores, and with a set of 18 lenders globally, massive stitching of documents and meeting the demands of the various stakeholders. I still remember that was my best learning of how to look at a project, of a large-scale project, from lenders and the lawyers' perspective and the investors' perspective. Yeah. Lowest? Oh, many lows. Which one? I'll give that question a pass.
Okay, great. One innovation that has stuck by you during the times of pandemic, what would that be? One biggie.
The doctors giving you complete advice on a WhatsApp call with full prescription and then consultation, and you get well. That was unheard of, and that to a senior doctor. Normally, it will take me 2 weeks for appointment and 2 hours to sit outside his clinic to get my turn. And I'm just amazed at the at what COVID has done to that whole thing.
Okay. Santosh, I come to you. One big takeaway that you've had from this conversation today, which you did not have before, what would that be? One big learning.
To see the power of conviction coming through. I mean, look, I think I did not expect a strong conversation. I expected a conversation that circled around policy, that circled around thought processes. Unexpected.
So we fared well. Okay, now I come to you now, Mr. Shroff. We began that conversation the first with the Ajit Kumar joke. What is the joke going on to your mind today in terms of policymakers and corporate talk for infrastructure space in India?
No, I haven't thought of infrastructure jokes, but my granddaughter is back and I'm going to show her to you. But actually, I have a question for each one of you.
Sure.
Because in these times when it is sort of very easy to be low and depressed, I think one of the things we kind of do not do enough justice to ourselves and life is what is that every day we should be counting our blessings and asking ourselves the question of what should we be grateful for. So I'm going to ask you the question, Shrija, if you can think about one thing which you are grateful for in all this. Ramesh may have inadvertently answered my question already, but I'm going to make him answer that question again. But I think every conversation should end with a thought about what should we be grateful for. There are a lot of things which we don't expect and are a problem, but there are a multitude of things that we should be grateful for as well. So Shrija, over to you. What are you grateful for?
I'm grateful for the fact that I get to speak with some very important and interesting people over the course of my career, and the very fact that they all open up to me in the way that it is very unbiased. They see me as a messenger of truth and justice. I actually remember that from all these conversations, I take away so much and I learn so much. It's also been an inspiration. And I sort of asked this question from an entrepreneur who was actually my age, who was a unicorn entrepreneur. And I asked him that you have almost everything, you're just 30. What do you look forward to in a day? So he said that, Shrija, I look forward to one thing in a day. And today I was looking forward to our conversation. So I think that is something that really stayed with me, that, conversations and becoming better storytellers, that is what we need in the world. For me, that is.
Ramesh, same question to you. Today I've kind of taken the mic away from you.
Yeah. I'm putting me in a spot. I think, frankly, I would be grateful to this country that despite all its frailties and issues, I think it has given us the opportunity. It has never stopped us from doing the right things or aiming and aspiring to be better and better. I think we should be grateful because we criticize, we keep on criticizing everything around us, and we fail to realize that many of us have come up in this system with its limitations, but actually it has never stopped us from dreaming big or achieving things. I think we should be grateful for that also at times, and we have to give back then to improve the system.
Thanks, well said.
We have some questions from the audience. We will just take like 2 questions, running out of time.
No, let Santosh answer my question.
Oh, Santosh.
How can you let him go? Can't let him go.
Okay, very quickly, I think what I take away from this entire difficult time, I can actually I can walk out of the room and I can see my wife and son throughout the day. He can walk into the room and very often he says, you can do your call. I'll be quiet in the room and I will just sit here with you. I think those are moments, and the amount of time I would otherwise spend in office is incredible. And to be able to do all of that and still be in the same room as it's an amazing thing.
That's good.
But I would be grateful for something similar to what Ramesh said. I'm grateful that I am in India, and I'm grateful at the opportunities that this country presents, and I'm grateful that I can actually have a conversation like this, speak my mind. And it's not possible in many countries in the world. So it's.
Also, you have a lovely granddaughter whom
Yes.
you're like dying to see now. Okay. There are two questions, so we can take those. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
After the
I'm going to
two,
step aside for a second, but Santosh, you take the question.
Sure.
yeah. It said that after the 2008 crisis, investment in infrastructure took a massive toll. Oh, she's there. She's so adorable.
Okay, go ahead.
Shrija, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. After the 2008 crisis, investments in infrastructure took a massive toll and could only cope up after about 10 years. In light of that, what would be the effect of COVID-19 the infrastructure investment sphere, especially in India? Ramesh, you want to take that up?
Yeah. When I'm talking to some of the global investors in infrastructure today, what I hear from them is their view of India has not changed, COVID or no COVID. I think they see the need. In fact, they are becoming more and more, I would say, inch by inch more positive about the fact that India has perhaps the best ecosystem today for investments, given the choices across the world. Yes, there are issues. Okay, there is no denying that, but they are not unfixable. And I think many people are now also toying with the idea of getting used to some of these issues and trying to see how they can risk adjust their expectations. So my view is that there's more and more. I would say India is not lost out in this COVID. India has gained overall. Also, the stature of India, the way it tackled the COVID, the way the country reacted, the maturity with which it has done so far, and the geopolitical situation of India vis-a-vis some of our giant nations across the border, I think has helped India to actually gain a lot of points on the table.
Okay. One last question is that how do you see the dispute between global powers impacting the ability of multilateral institutions like World Bank, ADB, IMF to fund, especially infra development funding?
Well, look, my view is India is, this is my personal, very, very personal view, that India is well past the stage where it had to really depend on some of these institutions. I think that we have the wherewithal to now, let's say, capture the attention of whoever wants to invest on merit. And if we can get some of these issues which we discussed today right, I don't think we really need them, because this is not for the. I think India is going well past the mark. So I won't give too much. I won't spend sleepless night wondering what these institutions want or what how can they be useful. I think we have to look at the larger pool of investors. Okay, who are looking to deploy capital in India, and we should be asking a simple question: how to make them comfortable, and give them the assurances that they feel are minimum required assurances to put money.
Yeah, there's huge capital on the sideline waiting to get invested, Mr. Shroff, and you also alluded to. There's one good morning, excellent point by Cyril and Ramesh, but has the infrastructure PPP risk profile changed drastically as a result of the pandemic, requiring more multilateral and or sovereign support in new forms, be it land capture? I think we've kind of sort of answered and addressed that question also. Yeah. So thank you so much for this meaningful conversation. And I think we had some great takeaway points. And Mr. Schwartz made us all focus and think about what we are grateful for in our lives. On that thought, here's wishing you all goodbye, good luck, and stay safe. And join us with the finale session of the thought leadership discussion, Mr. Lamachal Mangal Das, next Saturday, 11 a.m. Till the time, goodbye and good luck. Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you, Sapru. Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for joining us. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Shrija.
Thank you. Thank you.